Welcome everyone to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast, the podcast focused on leadership. The episode will begin shortly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Dr. John Bedker Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, John Bedker. Well, regular listeners know we began this year by taking this sort of macro, this higher level view of what might portend, what might be coming in the year 2024. Well, today we're going to kind of continue that theme, but we're going to try to operationalize it. What are the leadership core competencies that each of you, each of us, need to be mindful about? How can we bring leadership to this turbulent world and the turbulent times we're living in? I think that's really important to begin the year, not only looking at what might happen, but how we might lead. So let's do that. Let's begin. First, we're going to talk about reflection, a very important leadership core competency. I've spoken about it before. I've dedicated an entire podcast to it almost a year ago now. I've also spoken on it at public events. It is that important. And in our turbulent world, I think it is an excellent starting point. Why? Well, because mindfulness and reflection are key to understanding not only who we are, but to understand truly what is going on. So, an important beginning. There are many ways to go about doing this. I'm going to mention 3 that I think are critical for leaders, and these would be important leadership core competencies for us each to practice. Certainly, we will begin with self-reflection, taking that time with ourselves to think, to ponder, to reflect. This self-reflective practice is absolutely critical for leaders, and particularly in the turbulent times we're living. Okay, self-reflection. In my consulting life, oftentimes doing executive coaching, talking with leaders, that is one of the first things. Do you take time to sit down with yourself and think about, how am I doing? How am I doing with myself? How am I doing with others? Important first step. Second reflective practice I think is important is peers, those people you value, your colleagues, your coworkers. If you're a senior member of management, that senior management team. If you're a worker on that floor, your fellow floor workers. That peer group, it's important. Not only to check in, but then to take that time to reflect about what they're saying and what you're thinking. That peer reflection, very important. And the other thing is those you might not necessarily have regular contact with. This broad group we'll just call others. If you're a member of senior leadership, shouldn't you be walking down on that shop floor, just stopping and taking a moment and checking in with that worker, that person that makes you look so good? So then, what did they say? What was important to them? What did they share with you? That reflective practice from information gained from others, hugely important. And what it leads to in this turbulent times that's so important is this leadership core competency of situational awareness, really knowing what's going on. We do that by some of these reflections I've started with. But there are so many other components to situational awareness. Not what you would like to think is going on, not what you want to have going on, but rather to try to get through all those filters that leaders are often having to deal with, confronted with, to get to that unfiltered truth. Now, truth might be one of the most important, if not the most important, leadership core competencies for these troubled times we're living in. Honesty, reliability, consistency. You've heard me on previous podcasts talk about an axiom. I'm going to mention it again here. For leadership to be effective, it must be consistent. And that consistency must be grounded in the truth. All right, one more time. For leadership to be effective, it must be consistent. So, if I tell someone on that shop floor, someone in that office down the hall, a customer, a vendor, a worker, those messages need to be consistent. I can't tell one constituency one thing and another something different. Leaders need consistency. We must have it in these turbulent times. Well, what does that lead to? Back to that issue, truth, that I said is perhaps the most important in these troubled times. Truth. That seems simple, but I will tell you, oftentimes it can be very hard. Difficult to tell the truth. Sometimes, as a leader, you wish you didn't have to tell the truth. But you do. That is a core value, a core leadership competency for an effective leader. So, the simple story, the easy story, 2 plus 2 equals 4. It does. That's the truth. That's the fact. It's not 3. It's not 5. It's not any other number. 2 plus 2 is 4. Well, of course, you sit here and say, well, I know that. Everybody knows that. That's absolutely correct. Yeah. There are so many other truths that we don't manage that way, that we might not speak up or speak out about, that we might let pass, knowing that it is not the truth. Examples. Well, on the macro scale, the news scale, we all know these things, right? You know, did the current president, was it an election where more people voted for Joe Biden than voted for Donald Trump? Well, the answer factually is yes. Now, there are these large populations of people that say that's not the truth. Leaders must stand up and say, no, the truth is that many more people, some 7 million more, voted for Joe Biden. It's simply the truth. 2 plus 2 is 4. It's not something else. It's the truth. Okay. So then what does that lead us to? Well, it leads us to a number of other leadership core competencies I want to touch on. Let's go to the Israel-Hamas war, another thing that's in the news. We all know about it. And what do we know? We know that there was a terrible atrocity brought by Hamas, a militant group in Gaza. Terrible. And then there was a response. Hamas killed some 1,200 and took roughly 200 hostages. Well, what did Israel do in response? And they have every reason to respond, right? As a leadership matter, not talking about politics and culture, religion. As a leadership matter, you do have not only the right, but frankly, the responsibility to respond, particularly to something as heinous as what Hamas did. So, what is that response? Is it 25,000 deaths and rising? Almost 25 times what Hamas did? Is that the right leadership response? Now, Israel would have you say, well, we need to destroy Hamas, all of them. And if they are below ground, for instance, in a hospital, several stories about that, well, too bad. We will bomb that hospital. And innocents will die. But we're doing this for this good of eliminating Hamas. Well, as a leadership matter, that is a tough one to defend. And here's why. The next leadership core competency I want us to really capture is empathy. Really capture that. Empathy. Why is that so important? Well, Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote an entire book on this called Leadership. And she said the number one leadership core competency for leaders of nations, she was talking about U.S. presidents, but it applies globally, was empathy. So critical. So think about that. Think about that not in these terrible military conflicts, but think about that in your leadership journey. Are you empathetic? Are you encouraging others, whether it's a peer or a colleague, someone that you lead, someone that you care about? Empathy and encouraging the heart are leadership core competencies hugely necessary in these troubled times. Think about that in terms of comments from the current candidate for President Donald Trump or from the current Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you get a sense of empathy from them? I'm afraid that the answer is no in both cases. Again, absolutely not politics. Think about leadership. Are leaders bringing to the table those leadership core competencies so necessary, so essential in our troubled times? Well, what are we doing, for instance, when we do show empathy? So important, right? A genuineness, genuine empathy. And what's that lead to? Genuine support. For instance, in the case of communication, another really important leadership core competency, this listening to others, whoever they might be, not just to what they're saying, but actually hearing what they are saying. That's what creates the empathy, by genuinely hearing, not just listening. Very, very different things. Well, we all, in these really difficult times, need to ensure that we are mindful and aware of some of these important leadership core competencies, to regularly do these things, to practice these things, to incorporate and deliver critical leadership core competencies in our practice of leadership. We have to remember that there is another acronym, and I'll do this quickly. FIT. Again, many of you have heard me mention this before. FIT, frequency, intensity, and time. FIT. Frequently practice these leadership core competencies. Do it with intensity, not to be loud, not to be boastful, but to show intention that you genuinely care and sustain it over a period of time. For leadership to be effective, it must be consistent. We need to do these things over a long period of time. So incorporate and deliver these critical leadership core competencies frequently with intensity over time. Remember, folks, there really and truly are only one set of facts. If you accept things that are not factual, you will not be as effective as you can be, as you are needed to be as a leader. The facts are just that, the facts. Now, people certainly are entitled to a point of view, right? Everyone's entitled to their own point of view, but they are not entitled to their own facts. Now, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan coined that phrase, but I think it's particularly important in this turbulent world that we are living. So let's review. Leadership is so critical today, perhaps more important than at any other time in our lives. We've looked at some of these issues in the last episode that may be prospectively occurring, but whatever it is, however it affects us in our leadership practice, what can we do to prepare for leading in a turbulent time? I began by talking about reflection and reflective practice, not only with yourself, but with your peers and absolutely with others. I spoke about situational awareness, really understanding what's going on to get through the filters that we're often confronted with in leadership, to really understand unfiltered what is going on, what is the situation. Because that is the truth, not what someone might tell you or want you to believe, or is the common discussion, but rather what is the truth. Talked about how important truth is in each of our leadership practices. That axiom I mentioned for leadership to be effective, that it must be consistent. I raised the point that truth can be hard. It is. It's difficult to kind of go against the grain, to not go with the common thought of a group that you're surrounded by. Well, how do we go about being successful in that? We have to speak up, we have to speak out, we have to represent the truth, and we have to defend the truth. We don't need to do that in a vitriolic way. We need to be empathetic. We need to encourage the heart of others. I mentioned this in my comments. Hugely important qualities in our turbulent world. What happens then is this genuineness, this authenticity comes out, because we're not just listening to others, we are actually hearing them. And we need to do that frequently, with intensity, over time. The FIT axiom that I mentioned. All right, so the set of facts are important. Honesty, truth, beginning with reflection, but leading from what is so, not from what people might want to tell you, or you might find easier to believe than having to stand up for what is right. Okay, there we go. A couple of leadership core competencies, actually several, that we all need to be mindful about in our turbulent world, our troubled world, oftentimes a chaotic world. And what we need to do is bring some calm, some empathy, some caring, some genuineness, some authenticity to each of our practices of leadership. It really will make a difference. It really will help. And it honestly will make those that you lead follow. And that is the last one, modeling the way. Each and every one of us needs to do that. Model the way. All right, everyone, there you go. Quick review of some of those ways we need to operationalize our leadership practice. Looking forward here to 2024. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for tuning in to Dr. John Bedker's Leadership Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tell your friends, and, of course, please follow our podcast and subscribe. Thank you again for tuning in.